Hi everyone, because today, the 27th of May, is what I believe to be Dante's 759th anniversary of his birth. I'm going to be talking about a history of the translation of his great magnum opus, the Divine Comedy, into a lot of the major world languages. And I do have a previous video based off of a blog post specifically about the history of the poem's translation into English. So you guys can go check that out in my playlist called All About Dante and the Divine Comedy. And I would like to, apologize in advance. I'm going to try to do my best, obviously, but I really do apologize if I inadvertently, mangle the names of any of these translators or put the stress on the wrong syllable. I'm doing my best, but, when it's not your own native language, sometimes you just mess up. The very first complete translation, to hopefully nobody's surprise, was in Latin, Catholic Europe's lingua franca, in 1416 by Giovanni da Serravalle. This was done in prose, and mostly for the benefit of English bishops Nicholas Bubwith and Robert Hallam, attendees of the Ecumenical Council of Constance of 1414 through 1418, which, among several other important matters they addressed, ended the Western Schism. Da Serravalle also wrote a commentary on Dante's life and work. The first Latin verse translation by poet Matteo Ronto was produced from May 1427 through May 1431. He used hexameters, and I should also mention, some of the sources I looked at were only counting actual published translations, i.e. the printing press. I'm also including, manuscript translations, which would have been, circulated through various means, because, obviously, of course, books didn't start with the printing press, and of course, these earlier translations still count. It's just they maybe weren't as widely, available necessarily, because, it did cost a lot of money and a lot of time and effort to produce an illuminated manuscript, but they definitely existed, and just because some people only count the actual printed book translations, that does not make the earlier ones any less valid or real. That history really does start with the manuscript translations. The first vernacular language the poem was translated into was Castilian, in other words, Old Spanish, which Enrique de Villena completed in 1428. He used prose. The first vernacular translation in verse came a year later, in 1429, by Catalan poet Andreu Febrer, when I'm inserting an image of that. Another early translation was by Balthazar Grangier in French in 1597. Many people criticized him for not properly understanding Dante's themes and intentions, though his was the only French translation for almost 2 centuries. The next ones came from Moutonnet de Clairefonds in 1776 and Piedmontese-born Antoine Rivaroli in 1783, and were only of Inferno. A full French translation appeared in 1812 from Alexis François Artaud de Montour, followed by Pier Angelo Fiorentino's 1840 translation, and the highly acclaimed 3-volume 1855 translation by Félicité de Lamennais. Paolo Principato made a Sicilian translation in the 17th century. The first German translation, in prose, was done by Lebrecht Bachenschwanz from 1767 through 1769. Karl Ludwig Kannegieser translated it into verse from 1809 through 1821. Other early German translations were by Adolf Friedrich Karl Streckfuss from 1824 to 26, and Swiss-Italian pastor Giovanni Andrea Scartazzini from 1874 through 90. About 90 German translations appeared in the century after Kannegieser's. Dmitry Dmitrievich Minayev published parts of Inferno in Russian in 1843 and translated the entire first canticle in 1855. His Purgatorio and Paradiso were posthumously published in 1907. Simultaneous to these translations, Yelizaveta Vasilievna Kologrivova published her own from 1842 to 43. Dante was considered distasteful in Russia on account of the theological clash between Catholicism and Orthodoxy, similar to how he was viewed in the largely Protestant Anglophone world for centuries. And I went into this a bit in my video and blog posts about the history of the poem being translated into English. People, just lost interest or were never interested in him at all. Oh, he was a Catholic and we're Protestants, or in the case of the Eastern Europe, Russia, Bulgaria, Greece, whatever, that, obviously the Orthodox part of the world. It was just like, oh, he's a different religion, and we're not supposed to associate with people of other religions. We only live what we know, and that must be automatically heretical and bad. And oh, he also, talks about classical Greek and Roman, quote unquote, pagan philosophy and people. He's actually celebrating them instead of condemning them. So obviously, and then he just, and also obviously the Middle Ages. So he basically represents several different types of worlds they like not only had no interest in, they just thought were like distasteful, like against their religion. And well, thankfully that, has mostly, gone by the wayside. And now people understand, he was a great writer for writing for all time and, eternity. The Latin had since been displaced by French as Europe's lingua franca. A new Latin translation in hexameters by Abbot Gaetano dalla Piazza was posthumously published in 1848, 4 years after his death. And, even though like people were basically using French as a language of like diplomacy and literature and all this other jazz from I think like the 17th century onwards, they were still using Latin for like writing like scholarly books and such like that. So it wasn't like people like totally disused Latin. It was just like used for different things that it had been, and it wasn't nearly as widely used as French had since become. Christian Knud Frederick published the first Danish translation in 1855 in Terza Rima, the poetic style Dante invented to write the Commedia, which I also have a video about. You guys can check out in my playlist all about Dante and the Divine Comedy. Among its admirers was Hans Christian Andersen. In 1860, Julian Korsak's first Polish translation was posthumously published, 5 years after his death. The first Hebrew translation of Inferno by Saul Formigini came in 1869. Parts of the Commedia appeared in Hungarian in 1806 and 1850, though the first complete translation didn't appear till 1885 through 1899 by Caroy Sas. Bartolomé Mitre, the president of Argentina, worked on a Spanish translation between 1862 and 68, which was posthumously published in 1922. And I haven't seen the translation, obviously, so I don't know if he was writing this in Latin American Spanish or like Spanish from like continental Europe. Like, so maybe, I guess maybe at the time, perhaps like people were still being like educated in colleges and stuff, and like the so-called like good Spanish, the formal Spanish from the old country in Spain, instead of the uniquely Latin form of Spanish which evolved. So that would be very interesting to check out. And if there aren't like really any like major differences besides like local words and stuff that people in Spain don't have need to know, like for example species of flowers and animals and such in Latin America. But probably the main difference most people who have studied Spanish are familiar with is that people in Spain use vosotros, vosotras, and people in Latin America do not use that. That's basically the plural formal like second person, so you're addressing a group of people, like the formal you, like use guys. What I use are like many people in the South use them, y'all. So basically that's just like a big difference in the language. In 1888, 2 Portuguese translations came from Francisco Bonifacio de Abreu and Jose Pedro Xavier Pinheiro in Brazil. And this would presumably be like, Brazilian Portuguese instead of Portuguese. But again, I personally have no idea, like maybe like the high class or whatever, the middle class or the people who were just getting educated at that point in time, they thought, oh, you should only learn that so-called high class proper, like Portuguese and Spanish from the continent instead of like the uniquely South American like language forms that were developing. So that would be really, really interesting to look into. Arsène Gazikian, a Mechitarist monk, published the first Armenian translations of the 3 canticles in, respectively, 1902, 1905, and 1924. He lived on the island of San Lazzaro degli Armeni near Venice and produced many translations of classical Latin, Greek, Italian, and English literature. Standalone Inferno translations have been most popular in Armenian, and some translators, unfortunately, were murdered during the Armenian genocide. The Armenian people feel a powerful symbolism and connection between Inferno and their great national tragedy, and some of these translators have even like dedicated their translations to people who were murdered during the Armenian genocide, or they draw like parallels in their work. Obviously, they're not like, totally changing it like, Mary Jo Bang was. I was just like, oh, just make it up as I go along and put in totally anachronistic 20th and 21st century pop culture references, but they're just, like drawing certain things out, maybe using language in a bit of a, different way, because they just really connect with Dante so much, not just the poem, but, his entire life. And I've been an Armenophile since the age of 15 in the spring of 1995. So I really can like see where they're coming from, like totally relating to him, and why Inferno in particular would just like speak to the soul of their people, because they went through their own, Inferno in 1915, and even before that, like, the 1890s and 1905, there were smaller scale genocides carried out against the Armenian people in Turkey. Hopefully someday, like, every country in the world will recognize what happened in Turkey, will finally quit denying it, and Azerbaijan unfortunately also denies it. But, hopefully, like, someday sense will prevail and they will finally, like, recognize this horrific tragedy. The first Japanese translation came in 1914 from Heizaburo Yamakawa, who worked from Longfellow's poetic but rather dated English translation of 1867. In 1919, Masaki Nakayama made a proper Japanese translation from the original Italian and chose to render it in prose instead of rhyme. Yamakawa's version became the reference text for Qian Daosun, who published the first Chinese translation in 1921, though only the first 3 cantos of Inferno. The first complete Mandarin Chinese translation came in 1939 by Fu Donghua. This version, like Daosun's earlier work, wasn't directly translated from Dante's Italian, but from 19th century French and English translations. The first complete Chinese translation of the original text didn't appear till 1997 by Tian Dewang. He began this project in 1982, and it did take a bit longer. I think I'll be discussing this a bit later and in future videos, for the poem to start reaching non-Western languages, for the big reason because they're by and large not Christian, and Dante was so like heavily Christian, even though of course the poem speaks across time and place, but a lot of these like references they just don't understand, and that also presents unique challenges when translating. For example, if you don't have a concept of like purgatory, like a paradise or hell in your own like language or culture or religion, like how are you going to express that, or like try to explain it in a way people will understand? So that's like really something I'm looking forward to getting into in a future video and blog posts, like the unique challenges of translation for people in non European cultures and languages and religions. The first modern Catalan translation by Narcís Verdaguer y Callis was published in 1921 to mark the 600th anniversary of Dante's death. The first Dutch translation by Albert Verbe was published in 1923, and the first Romanian translation by George Coșbuc appeared in 1925. A Yiddish translation of Inferno by Lithuanian-born Shmuel Kohav Stern was published in 1932. The same year, Nikos Kazantzakis published a complete translation in the modern Greek, and very sadly, the Yiddish translator, he immigrated to pre-state Israel, but unfortunately, I guess he wasn't making money or things weren't working out, so he went back to Europe, and sadly, he ended up being murdered in the Shoah, and I believe a few like other translators were also like murdered in the Shoah. And like I was just like rewatching something I had watched like a few years ago in preparation for writing this blog post. I'll get back to it as well for my future planned videos and like posts about like the other translation challenges. A number of writers, translators, they ended up in the gulag, like they were like offending against the thugs in the Soviet Union or like other like puppet regimes behind the Iron Curtain. It's just like, really sad. And like, so this, you can really understand how Dante's work, in particular Inferno, would just really speak to them, because they're going through their own personal hell in their country. Like people saying, oh, you can't translate this, or you're not translating it in the way I like politically, or oh, you're in, and these people are just basically going through what Dante did in like a slightly different way. Obviously not the exact specifics of medieval Italy, but they're just like, oh, you're butting up against the way like politics are supposed to be, or you're offending our groupthink echo chamber, off to the gulag with you. And like, and just some of these people, like when they came back, they it strengthened their faith, and they were still like loving Dante, and it made their literary bond with him even stronger. So that's just like a really special way he has on people across these generations and centuries, as I've said in several previous videos and blog posts. Like, of all my favorite writers, he's just about the only, well, maybe Hermann Hesse a little bit, very much too, but like Dante, like above and beyond even Hermann Hesse, he just feels like a personal friend, because like he addresses the audience in the first person, and you can just relate to so many things he's going through, because, who hasn't like dropped so low and felt like, oh, I can never get out of this. Like usually multiple times throughout life, you feel like, oh, I'm so depressed, or this is a bad time in my life and whatever. And then eventually you start rising up through like more hopeful, more prettier, like happier places, until finally you emerge back on track with your life and faith. So that's just like something really, really profound. Like Dante speaks to so many people like around the world, like through all these centuries. Like, who would have ever guessed that back when he started like, writing it in the 14th century? The first Arabic translation, by Hassan Othman, appeared in 1955. He skirted the huge problem of Canto 28 of Inferno, depicting Mohammed and his nephew Ali in hell, by taking out the offending lines altogether and like mentioning something in a footnote about like this was here in the original, but Dante was very misinformed about our precious holy prophet. And I'll be getting more into that in my future video and blog post about, censorship with the Divine Comedy and translation issues. As most people know, so-called blasphemy in the Islamic world brings the death penalty, and it's just like really, really unfortunate. Like I've been learning a lot about like, Islamic theology and history. I had no idea. I didn't learn in any of my like religion classes. I mean, obviously that's a whole thing for another post, but if you're, like translating like certain books, and when you're in a country ruled by, Islamic nut jobs, you really, really have to be careful, because like the writing or translating or reading or owning the so-called wrong thing or selling it, it could like land you like 100 lashes or being hanged in public. So that's just like really unfortunate. And again, that's something that really speaks to so many people about Dante's own world and life. Oh, they're living under like not well literal hell, but like metaphorical hell under like the mullahs in Iran or like Saudi Arabia or something like that. And they're reading, oh, this is like a man going through a terrible period in his life. He's going through hell and seeing all these horrible tortures, and I can like relate to this in my own way, because it's very similar to what people in my country are going through, because we don't have freedom. So that's just again and again and again, he just like speaks so wonderfully to people just all across the world and like so many different cultures. The first Persian translation, by Shojat Eddin Shafa, was published in 1957, but didn't earn a lot of acclaim. At that point in history, Iran was still a modern, liberal, Western, mostly secular democracy, so there was no worry about Islamic nutjobs arresting people for translating or reading so-called haram books. And surprisingly, the Persian translation industry of Dante has like really taken off in more like recent years. So, but I guess that those translators also have to like skirt around the huge issue of Muhammad being in hell by just like taking it out, or just mentioning a footnote. Oh, Dante was like confused because, well, I mean, that was a legitimate confusion. Many medieval Christians falsely believed Muhammad was originally a Nestorian Christian and therefore like a heretic and schismatic, even though according to the history he was like never any kind of Christian. He like looking at the Quran and watching all these videos I've been like well, not reading, like watching lately, like he really was very confused about like the Christian and Jewish Bibles, like basically like, oh, getting all these like facts wrong and like confusing people with the same name and just like really like weird stuff like that. But obviously that's a whole topic for its other post. A Ukrainian translation of Inferno by Petro Karmansky was published in 1956. A complete translation by Yevhen Drobyazko didn't appear till 1976. The first Korean translation by Yi Sang-ro appeared in 1959. 4 other Korean versions have since been published. First-time translations in the later 20th century include, and you guys can feel free to correct me if like I'm not aware of earlier translations, or maybe there were like partial earlier translations, and these things I was reading about in like an Italian language source, they're just talking about full translations or like mainstream translations that got a lot of notice, because apparently in that video I mentioned earlier, there were the first Turkish translations appeared after World War I, although according to the Italian language source I was consulting for a lot of this blog post and video, the first Turkish translation only appeared in 1998. So that's obviously a huge contradiction in years. So maybe like there was only like Inferno published after World War I, but I would obviously have to look more into that. Esperanto, 1963, Giovanni Peter Longo. Irish, 1963, Padraig de Bruin. Norwegian, 1965, Henrik Ritter and Sigmund Skard. Occitan, 1967, Jean Roche. Macedonian, 1967, Georgi Stalev. Icelandic, 1968, Erlingur Halldórsson. Kazakh, 1971, Mukagali Makatayev. Maltese, 1991, Alfred Palma. Turkish, 1998, Rekin Teksoy. In 2001, Kilimanor Ramakantan translated the poem into Malayalam, the first time it had ever appeared in an Indian language. In 2006, Nguyen Van Hoan published the first Vietnamese translation, and Shayamal Kumar Gango Padhayai, I'm sorry I'm mangling these pronunciations, created the first Bengali translation in 2011. The poem was also translated into many Italian dialects during the 19th century, such as Calabrian, Milanese, Veronese, Neapolitan, and Venetian. Under Mussolini's rule, new translations in Genoese, Roman, Bolognese, and Venetian were published. During the second half of the 20th century, other dialect translations included Istrian, Paduan, Abruzzese, Barese, Turinese, and Comasco. A Triestine translation appeared in 2021. In total, there are about 24 dialects with translations, and obviously, like many people might know, Dante didn't write the poem in Italian. He wrote it in medieval Florentine Tuscan Italian, which is basically a dialect of a dialect, but that did eventually form the basis of the modern Italian language, because not just Dante, but so many other leading lights of the late Middle Ages and all through the Renaissance and the later periods of Italian history, they spoke in that language because they were from Florence or Tuscany. Other languages the Commedia has been translated into to date include Slovenian, Czech, Slovakian, Serbian, Sardinian, Friulian, Galician, Swedish, Bulgarian, Lithuanian, Latvian, Albanian, Finnish, Estonian, which is fairly recent, I believe, just within the last few years, Basque, Georgian, Afrikaans, Nepali, Urdu, Tamil, Kannada, which is an Indian language, Amharic, Mongolian, Provençal, Azeri, Breton, and Belarusian. Alas, some of these languages, such as Yiddish, Mongolian, and Amharic, have only had a translation of one canticle as of this date, while other languages, like Welsh, haven't had a new translation in over a century, and some other languages haven't had a new translation in over 50 years, and some haven't had one since the 90s or since the Iron Curtain fell. So it might just be a case of, oh, it's not a popular work, people just don't read it a lot or study it in this particular country or language or culture or whatever. So why would we bother with a new one? Or, oh, this is the standard one in Welsh and that's all people know, so why would we be bothered with a new translation when this is the classic standard, and many people just wouldn't be interested in it anyway. And Welsh is thankfully experiencing a big revival, but it still has a big way to go, and having a lot more literature written in Welsh, so maybe that's a little bit about it too, in languages that are still overcoming being almost extincted by I guess colonial powers or whatever in the past. So hopefully after these languages do have more native speakers who aren't speaking any other languages or are primarily using the new language like Welsh instead of the foreign language, then the translation industry will significantly improve. Turkish, Japanese, and Persian are 3 of the top 5 most prolific recent translations, which seems surprising given how long it took the poem to start reaching non-Western languages. German has the next most translations of any language after English, and French, despite having the first modern translation of the poem, it barely has any translation since maybe about 4 of them since 2020, when that video I was mentioning several times was filmed. So I don't know, maybe that will pick up too, or again it's just a case of, oh, this is the classic, or we only have a few, why should we bother when we already have a good translation? You don't fix what ain't broken. We're very, very happy with the Dante we're familiar with. Major world languages without a translation to date, as far as I'm aware of, or only snippets of one, include Hindi, Indonesian, Swahili, Telugu, Western Punjabi, Marathi, and Yue Chinese. There are also no translations into any indigenous African languages, and again, hopefully that will, start changing eventually. Dante's magnum opus transcends time and place. It may take a while, but eventually it'll reach these other languages and cultures, and yeah, the whole world can share in this like wonderful epic journey and understand what's so special about Dante, and find out how he speaks to them personally, maybe in ways he didn't necessarily like intend, but because like, oh, this is something in my culture, and this is I'm seeing very strong parallels with what Dante went through. So it's just like so many people can read the same book and they get something different out of it because of their own like frame of mind. Like, oh, maybe you're thinking, oh, this reminds me of my painful divorce, or when I was in love with someone who really didn't like me or just wanted to be friends, and I was humiliated when he like found out I was in love with him, and just other things like, or maybe just like moving to a different state or country, or you were dropping out of school, or like just facing like all sorts of other different like difficulties in your own life, and like just Dante speaks to you just the way like Shakespeare transcends, like resonates throughout time and place. It can be adapted to so many different like cultures and societies and historical periods, because the truths at the heart of the themes and the messages and the truths at the heart of his plays, they just they totally transcend the era he was writing, and they just speak to everybody. Thank you very much for watching. Please let me know down in the comments if there's like any major language translations which I missed. Maybe they've come out in the last few years and I just wasn't aware of them in the sources I was reading for my research, or if there's someone is like in process of translating into a language that hasn't yet been translated, or just like other translation news or updates or corrections I should know about. And again, I'm really sorry if I like inadvertently butchered some of the names, particularly the ones from non-Western languages. I practiced a lot. I was watching a lot of videos about Vietnamese pronunciation in particular for that name, because so many Vietnamese names, they just are not pronounced how they look to the Western eyes at all. But I did try to do my best. So again, like, thank you guys very much for watching, please leave a comment and consider subscribing if you guys haven't already, and I will see you very soon in my next video. I'm really looking forward to getting back into making more Dantean content. Bye.